to see long-term benefit, and being aspirational in the short term, as the opposition have been, will not solve anything in the third world. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, I'm going to do 6 things in my speech. First of all, I'm going to explain how the negative doesn't understand the role of the IMF and the WTO and its whole misconception of what gives countries flexibility. Then I'm going to refute all of the 3 substantive points of Cameron's speech, and then at the final 2 things, I'm going to mention the 2 things that I'm going to be talking about substantively in my speech. First of all, about labour standards, and second of all, about ethnic and socio-economic conflict within developing countries. But let's deal with this whole misconception. Underlying the very premise of everything we heard in Cameron's speech was this whole idea that what the IMF and the WTO do is give countries more flexibility over their own domestic economic policy. Well, fundamentally, that's absolutely wrong. First of all, it's wrong common sense, because every country prima facie has the flexibility to do what it wants, and any external interference can only limit that by very definition. But second of all, when you look at what the IMF and the WTO does, and Cameron says they were, he always referred to it in his speech, the IMF and the WTO, as if they were the same kind of umbrella group. Well, we'd say, while their economic objectives are largely the same, they do different things. I'll tell you what they are, Karen, sit down and listen and learn. The IMF, for example, gives loans to developing countries to develop their economy, and it conditions those loans on certain domestic policy targets that must be achieved, such as certain labour standards, certain reductions in spending, certain low inflation targets. All of these economic targets means that the extent of a government's domestic policy options are limited, because the IMF has limited the options that it can take. You saw this in Southeast Asia in the economic crisis in 1997, when every single Southeast Asian country had to do exactly what the IMF said in order to achieve its loans. The second thing is the WTO, which sets trade policy. Trade policy, by very definition, is prescriptive. It's centralised. It's from Geneva. Countries must follow it. How on earth this increases countries' flexibility, Cameron? I'd very much like to hear it.
Andrew, what are you advocating in your approach, in your model today, if you're saying that the WTO and the World Bank are already doing what they're meant to do?
No, we're not.
If you're saying that they're already enforcing strict standards, then what's your model about? Where's the problem?
Yes, our model is allowing countries, as Jeremy said in his speech, to do 3 things. It's allowing them to have tariffs and only reduce them as that country sees fit, rather than as the IMF sees fit, like flexibility. It's allowing those countries to have labour standards, which the IMF says you shouldn't have because they're counterproductive, i.e. flexibility on domestic policy, which the IMF doesn't want. So I don't understand quite where your point of information is getting at. But moving on to the 3 points in your speech, Cameron. First of all, this idea about incentives to improve standards. I got in a point of information in my speech and I said, well, aren't the only incentives for developing countries under a model of complete free trade to lower standards as much as possible to attract investment? And Cameron conceded this, and he said, okay, yeah, all right, Andrew, you might be right at the very beginning, but over time it'll all even out in the end. Well, we'd say, Cameron, no, wishful thinking, Tiger. What actually happens is that over time, the countries realise, gee, if we lose this investment, it's going to be disastrous, because there's another country down the road, across the continent, who also has low standards, and if our standards improve, the country will pick up, the company will pick up and invest in that other country, and so we'll have a whole lot of people without jobs, and our government will be subject to a coup. So what happens over time is that the standards stay low. That's the way the race to the bottom works. It is a permanent lowering of standards. But let's move on to the second idea in your speech, Karen. Second of all, job opportunities. The idea that jobs are better under foreign direct investment. And what we heard is that pretty much any job is a good job. What we'd say here, we've got to look at the kinds of jobs that we're talking about. In a model of foreign direct investment, companies invest money, they bring in the people to manage the enterprises in their country. The people who are employed are doing the shoelace tying, the shoemaking, the cattle last feeding. And so what you see is that it's not good on the long term as far as educating people to take up more managerial, more enterprising positions in a country's economy. On the other hand, if you look, and IT is a great example, because if you look at the way Japan, Korea, Taiwan and the successful Asian tigers did it, they had government investment in clever industries such as information technology. Because it was government investment, you had local people doing the work, and that enabled them to become experienced in the field and for those countries to gain a natural competitive advantage in those clever industries, something you don't see under foreign direct investment without government involvement. And the third part of Cameron's speech he obviously didn't understand because he spent one sentence on it. It's about government revenue. Well, government revenue is possible under any model. Under our model, we'd say the government has a greater ability to tax foreign direct investment, which is good for government revenue that it can spend on real things such as healthcare and education. Let's move on to my two substantive points. I'm actually going to deal with the second one first because I think it's really important, and that is about ethnic and socio-economic conflict. What is one of the common themes running through most developing countries? The common theme is that economic power is held by a political and populist minority. And that happens all the way through the Southern Hemisphere. In Southeast Asia, it's Chinese. In the Chinese minorities in the Philippines, Indonesia, and other Southeast Asian countries hold largely 80% of the economic wealth. In West Africa, it's Lebanese populations. In South Africa, it's the Indian populations. In North Africa, it's the Arab minorities. In Mexico, it's the Lebanese minorities. And in South America, it's the Spanish minorities as opposed to the Indian majorities. So the common theme is ethnic minorities holding economic power. What foreign direct investment does is it does two things. It increases the economic power of these ethnic minorities because they already have the resources and the capital to make the most out of foreign direct investment by engaging in partnerships with foreign direct investors. So, ethnic minorities get even richer than they already are. Meanwhile, the popular majorities who hold political power, because of what the IMF and the WTO says they have to do, the political power of the governments decreases. So the ability of the government of these countries in order to curtail the economic wealth of ethnic minorities decreases. So what you say is two things happening at the same time. Minorities getting wealthier and the political power of the majority decreasing. And that causes an ethnic tinderbox. And we've seen it. In the 15 years since the Washington Consensus was arrived at, we've seen this in the Philippines, we've seen it across the world. I'll list the examples after your POI.
What kind of situations are you talking about where there is a majority that holds political power and yet that majority is somehow really poorly done by in economic terms? It doesn't happen in...
Yeah, Indonesia, for example, where the Chinese hold 80% of the country's wealth but are only 3% of the population. And in 1997, as a response to the Asian financial crisis, which the Indonesian government had to follow everything the IMF said, you saw riots against Chinese minorities in Jakarta and throughout the Indonesian country. You see it in Mexico with anti-Lebanese riots. Now that Carlos Slim, a Lebanese man, Mexican, is now the richest man in the world. You see it throughout Russia where there's a growing rise of anti-Semitism because the 5 richest men in Russia are Jews. You see all across the world ethnic conflict breeded by globalisation. Moving on to my second point about labour standards. The problem with foreign direct investment is that the biggest advantage a developing country can have is low labour costs. We'd say that's fundamentally dangerous because it means the country can never afford to give up those low labour costs. So governments are faced with a choice in these countries. Either they can have decent labour standards or they can have foreign direct investment. Now most governments will follow the second line. And we'd say what our model does is it redresses that balance. Our model doesn't say that you can't have foreign direct investment. It simply says that countries must have the ability to be able to have those basic labour standards. And so what we'd say is that in our model we're ensuring that no multinational company can go into a developing country and abuse the labour standards of its ordinary people. And we'd say that's a good thing. It creates a base level by which foreign direct investment must comply, and that's good for labour standards. So for all of the above mentioned reasons, we are very, very proud to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, well, thank you to the first and second speakers from the Socialist Alliance tonight. We're very proud to have them here. So that's who attends this meeting. Look, what we're arguing tonight, and what has been completely glossed over by the affirmative team tonight, is the symbiotic relationship between business and good governance, between economic growth and the protection of civil society and standards in labour, in the environment, in being able to protect property and people walking down the street. And what we've had is that there's an absolutist line in that either a country can be controlled completely by transnational corporations or it's controlled completely by the government. But in reality, in almost every country, it's complex interdependent relationship between the two public and private sectors. So I'm going to list some of what the affirmative team has erroneously talked about before moving on to my substantive matter. And obviously tonight we've had a lot about the race to the bottom argument, that companies will simply move to countries where there are low standards, low labour costs, but this is simply, in business terms, a 1960s mindset, a 1950s mindset even, which is premised on the fact that all business is conducted purely on finding the cheapest labour to make some manufactured product rather, and that there's no room for innovation, there's no room for knowledge, not value-added knowledge products, and of course this argument from the affirmative team completely skips over that. And where people are making the most money in business, or where businesses want to get into, are the value-added industries that depend on intelligence, that depend on knowledge, that depend on education. And you only get this by investing in countries that already have high standards in health and safety. Yes, Jeremy?
That's fine in the first world, Dom, but when you look at the developed world, the only countries that have done well are the countries who rejected the Washington Consensus, who didn't liberalise their trade markets without having government interference.
No, rather the only countries in the third world that have done well are the ones that didn't mire themselves in ethnic and civil war. The ones, unlike say Ethiopia and Eritrea, that didn't blow their entire natural resource funded GDP on bitter sectarian conflict. And if we're going to look, if we're going to bring in examples of third world nations that have floundered in the era of globalisation, we need a holistic view. We can't just say, oh my God, Nike moved in and lowered all the standards. We also need to look, oh my God, look, all the rebel Marxist guerrillas stole all the boys in the water supply. So, as I was saying, and as my team was saying, good governance for the public interest and private profit for both domestic and international firms often go hand in hand. And what we've also heard from the affirmative team is a very, as I was saying, a very status view of the economy. That an economy's success or failure is purely and solely dependent on what government economic policies are. Rather, government economic growth is largely dependent on the strength of innovation of individuals, of private enterprise, of firms. And so what we have under globalisation, to bring it back to the original topic, is that the lowering of trade barriers, the lowering of subsidies and tariffs makes it easier for this private human capital in the third world to be unleashed and therefore raise living standards and promote economic growth. And just going back to my point about race, we've had a lot of talk tonight about ethnic minorities controlling the economy due to globalisation. And we've had ethnic minorities who use their power to purely purely entrench their ethnic privileges. Let's just take a step back. Is that really true? In what economy, in what country in the world can afford to do business by having a policy of only employing people from a particular race? Let's use an example. Say I'm in the 1960s and I'm a Chinese Filipino with a typewriter factory. Say I manufacture typewriter. I'm the richest man in the Philippines. Say I'm the richest man in the Philippines. I'm going to entrench myself making typewriters for the next 150 years, and no one will be able to assail my economic power because I've got the power of making typewriters. How far will I get? Nowhere. Thanks a lot, Microsoft. Thanks a lot, Apple. Thanks a lot, globalisation. So what we have is globalisation bringing in ideas, bringing in economic growth and raising everybody's living standard. I don't have much time.
Point of information.
Yes.
Don't you think that person's economic failure is not because they're Chinese, but because they decided to invest into my price?
Exactly my point. You're missing the point. My point is that you can't entrench economic power because there are always new human capital, new ways of doing things which undermine things. And so globalisation promotes this freedom of movement of capital and of goods and promotes the best possible system where old ideas can be overthrown by anyone who has the gumption and takes the risk to develop them. So to just recap what we've talking about tonight, globalisation gives governments and gives countries the incentive we need. Yes, we need governments enforcing standards, but on the whole, globalisation has been and will continue to be good for the third world. Thank you.
And you'll find out tonight, oh, it's a world of
Thank you, Cameron. The fundamental question coming out of Dom's speech tonight has been, well, how come, given the current economic environment, developing countries have not been able, despite their large amount of gumptions, to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and achieve the sorts of development outcomes that we've been trying to achieve for years and that we've set as goals. And fundamentally, the case that the negative have presented so far tonight depends on one fundamental principle. And this can best be summed up as the symbiosis of corporate interests and good national governance. Fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, this does not exist. Because when they're investing in a